volunteers for the library and a birthday party here. So this is
right.
the day of partying in the library.
Share cake later.
Yeah.
Day.
Yeah. So I'm Kathleen. I work here in the library, and we have two main poetry events and today's special event. We have a poetry open mic every other month called Poetry is Normal, because, you know, it's normal, and poetry is normal. And our next one of those is December 21st, the winter solstice, and you are invited to come back for that, this same place, in the evening, and there's little flyers out about that. So if you're a poet yourself or you love poetry, bring a poem or two to read aloud on that night. We'd be happy to see you again. Our other special event on alternating months is Poetry is Normal Presents, where we present guest poets and guest readers. And at the last one, these two guys were here, and they said, hey, the 200th birthday, and they'll tell us all about a particular letter and concept is coming up. We'd be happy to do a program here. So we're very happy that they're going to do this program today. And in January 17th, for Poetry is Normal Presents, Mike will be back with his co-author Bob Broad presenting a book that they have written on the evaluation of poetry, how to think about poetry. But today, Mike Theune from Illinois Wesleyan and Brian Rejack from Illinois State University are going to tell us all about why right now is really important in reference to John Keats. All right?
Yeah, right.
Yay.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. So I'm Brian Rejack. I teach over at ISU.
I'm Mike Theune, teach at Illinois Wesleyan.
And we're going to talk about John Keats and negative capability. It's an exciting time in the world of Keats, as Kathleen just mentioned. We're at the 200-year anniversary of basically all this stuff that happened with Keats's career. So negative capability is, interestingly, showing up in a lot of places. You may have encountered it. There are a few examples of things you can find it in here. But we're going to start off with a couple of contemporary examples using it. So one, this is from the movie Manhattan, and you'll hear Diane Keaton's character talking about negative capability.
Can you hear it?
Can you hear
Not
that?
at all.
Yeah, okay, so the sound, for whatever reason, is only coming out of here.
Shall I interpret?
Go ahead. We don't have subtitles.
Go ahead. So Woody Allen's talking about art, and he's going to talk about the exhibits that they've seen, greeting each other.
We can hear. We can hear.
Do you hear it enough?
Really, you like that?
No, I really felt it was very derivative. To me, it looked like it was straight out of Diane Arts, but it had none of the wit.
You know, we didn't like as much as the plexiglass sculpture. That I really meant.
Really, you like plexiglass, huh?
You didn't like the plexiglass sculpture either.
No,
It was a hell of a lot better than that steel cube. Did you see the steel cube?
now that was brilliant to me, absolutely brilliant.
The steel cube was great.
To me, it was very textural. You know what I mean? It was perfectly integrated, and it had a marvelous kind of negative capability. The rest of the stuff downstairs was bullshit.
Okay, so there's evidence one. And now our second one from the first season of True Detective, the HBO show. Matthew McConaughey's character here talks about his aptitude for getting confessions out of people, and he ascribes it to negative capability.
You're this wicked man. That's something else. Any bonus? Oh, I never really found it that hard. You know, you just look at somebody and think like they think. Negative capability. And I guess it's a skill. But most times you don't even need that. You know, you just look them in the eyes, the whole story's right there. Everybody wears their hunger in their home, you know. And he's got to be honest about what can go on up here.
bit of a darker tone to that one. So there are plenty of other examples in popular culture.
Philip Pullman here from The Golden Compass. So that's this fantasy novel in which negative capability is this almost magical ability that one needs. There's a weapon called the subtle knife. Has anybody read The Golden Compass? I think I'm right on this. There's a weapon called the subtle knife, which you have to be in a particular mental state, and that state is described as negative capability, and then you can use this knife to kind of cut portals into other dimensions and other planes of existence. But what you have to have is negative capability, and we'll talk about what negative capability is a little bit later on.
Yeah, so first we should just say a bit about John Keats and who he is. Here is a sketch of Keats. Here is a life mask of Keats, not the original, obviously. It's a copy I bought on eBay a couple years back. I actually own 2 life masks, full disclosure. Only brought one today. So Keats was a poet in the early 19th century, a British poet. And in addition to being a poet, he also wrote lots and lots of letters. So 252 of his letters survive. And Mike and I are 2 of the founding co-editors of this website called the Keats Letters Project, where on the 200-year anniversary of each letter, we have posts written by scholars and poems by poet, all sorts of stuff that we produce as a way of commemorating the 200-year anniversary of each of the letters. And you can see some of our recent content here. Keats is probably most known as a poet. You might know some lines like, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever," probably one of the most famous lines he ever wrote. Also, "Truth is beauty, beauty truth. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know." I think, okay, I got it right. But as a letter writer, Keats is just amazing for many reasons as well. And so one of the letters that we're approaching the 200-year anniversary of is just coming up next week. It's a letter he wrote from the 21st of December to the 27th of December in 1817, and this is where he coins the term negative capability. So Mike's going to tell us a little more about the letter and the term, and we'll get into it.
Sure. And so during this time in Keats's life, he has just come off of a huge writing project. He published his first volume some time ago. He's worked on the text of his second book, Endymion, his poetic romance, but he even saw that as a real kind of almost a gymnastic exercise. He's like, I'm writing 4,000 lines of poetry, and I'm just diving into it, and I'm doing it. And he finishes that up in
November 28th.
Right, in November. And now he's kind of done with writing for a little bit. In fact, this December, he's only going to write, so far as we know, we only have one poem of Keats's from December of 1817. And instead, it turns out that young John Keats is kind of out partying and really taking in London. He's at a number of dinners with friends. He's going to theater. The letter that negative capability appears in tells us about a number of these dinners. It tells about the fact that he's gone to different places. He's writing theatrical criticism, and he's going to have that published. Right? He's very active doing things. It turns out his brothers have taken off, his 2 brothers, George and Tom. They have gone to a kind of seaside resort town called Teignmouth. Tom, Keats's youngest brother, is ailing, and he has the family disease. It's tuberculosis. It's what will kill actually all of the Keats brothers. But he's in some of the earlier stages of that, and so they thought that it'd be good for Tom to get out of cold, drizzly London and pick some other cold, drizzly part of England to be in. Slightly less cold. That's right. And so they're in Teignmouth, and Keats writes this letters to his brothers to say, this is what I've been up to. And so it kind of recounts this. It talks about how he's also been out to sea. He saw the painting Death on a Pale Horse. He's just active. He's engaged in culture. He's partying. But then he also writes this letter. And so let's take a look at this relevant section of the letter. Kathleen, would you mind handing out a few more handouts, please? A few more people arrive. So Keats, we'll talk about a few of the details of the letter, I think, later on. But Keats writes of a letter. He talks about a lot of the things that he's up to. And then at the very near the end of the letter, he writes this, and the text is on the first page of the handout. Brown and Dilke, so it's Charles Brown and Charles Wentworth Dilke. They're two of Keats's good friends, and so there's some of the people he's hanging out with. He says, Brown and Dilke walked with me and back from the Christmas pantomime. I had not a dispute, but it's fantastic.
Right,
Go negative capability. I had not a dispute, but a disquisition with Dilke on various subjects. Several things dovetailed in my mind, and at once it struck me. What quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously? I mean negative capability. That is, when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Coleridge, for instance, would let go by a fine isolated verisimilitude caught from the penetralium of mystery, from being incapable of remaining content with half knowledge. This pursued through volumes would perhaps take us no further than this, that with a great poet, the sense of beauty overcomes every other consideration, or rather obliterates all consideration. So Keats talks about how he's walking home from the Christmas pantomime. So the pantomimes are...
Has anyone seen a Christmas pantomime? They're very popular in the UK, but it's not really an American tradition.
Right. So it's vaudeville, right? So it's silly, it's slapstick, it's commedia dell'arte, it's Punch and Judy shows, right?
Punch and Judy are characters in the pantomime, and then that's how they become these popular cultural figures.
That's right.
Yeah.
So Keats is on his way back from this, and we'll talk about it in a little bit, how he's kind of been mulling over some things, and he says, then it kind of struck me what it takes to make a person of achievement in literature, a person of the stature like Shakespeare, and the term that he gives that is negative capability, which he then describes most centrally as, right, when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. So let's just take a few minutes and dive into that for just a little bit. So first of all, one of the clearest things that negative capability is attached to here is Shakespeare's genius. So Keats loves Shakespeare. He's a bardolater. And so he, in fact, while working on Endymion, he actually kind of expressed the hope that Shakespeare would be the presider over his efforts. And in fact, he was saying,
I forget where he was staying. He, I think on the Isle of Wight, small island in the English Channel, and he rents a house there, and the owner of the house just happened to have this little image of Shakespeare on the wall, and Keats was so excited that she gave it to him, and he took it with him on his travels, and sort of hung it above where he would be writing on the poem. So in a similar way to how Keats is our presiding spirit today, that's the role Shakespeare played for Keats, especially during this period, but really throughout his whole writing career.
Absolutely. And Shakespeare meant something fairly particular for Keats. So, and Keats probably gets these ideas mostly from a critic who was active during Keats's day, who Keats actually knew in person. They weren't terribly close, but they were within each other's orbit, a guy named William Hazlitt. And Hazlitt, in some of his critical writing, would talk about, was trying to kind of figure out what is genius, what is artistic genius, what is poetic genius. And he said, for most people, for most accomplished poets, genius involves putting the stamp of your ego and your identity on the things of the world, and then revealing that kind of combination of the world plus your ego through your art. And he said that's just what kind of art and genius consists of. But he said there's one great exception to that, and the great exception to that is Shakespeare, right? And he said the thing about Shakespeare is that Shakespeare can kind of works without ego, and that what Shakespeare does is instead of kind of imposing his viewpoints and his mind and his identity on everything that he works with, instead Shakespeare is able to actually kind of imaginatively enter his characters' lives and kind of live through them and then convey that to us through his artwork. And so kind of thinking about Shakespeare here is kind of thinking about that. We can think about this ability as kind of sympathetic imagination, right? So that just as even Rust Cole says in True Detective, right, what I can do is I kind of sit there, I try to think how others are thinking, feel how they're feeling. Keats felt and thought the same way about Shakespeare, that's what he thought via Hazlitt, that Shakespeare could do that other geniuses didn't do. So it's a different kind of genius and kind of the highest form of genius. The other thing you should know about this, I think as well, is that, and maybe you get a sense of that, is that Keats becomes known and starts to take some pride in being an indolent poet, supposedly, although right, he's been working very hard. But what we have here is that negative capability is this kind of more, it seems like a kind of calm thing, the ability to dwell within mysteries, doubts, uncertainties, without any irritable reaching, right? So it's not struggling and striving to determine something, to make up your mind, to get everything right. It's about remaining kind of calm within a state of partial knowledge and partial knowing. And then we also see negative capability, of course, from what is being contrasted to here. We get some pictures here for people who are non-negatively capable. So right after negative capability is formulated, Keats says, look, somebody who's not negatively capable is Coleridge, right? And he says about Coleridge, he says, right, Coleridge, for instance, would let go by, so he would let kind of fly by him, a fine isolated verisimilitude caught from the penetralium of mystery, from being incapable of remaining content with half knowledge. Coleridge would have this beautiful insight into the mystery of the universe. He would contact it, he would be in communion with it, and then because his mind would immediately try to figure out what the meaning of that is, right? What's that significance? That he would then kind of ruin it because he's trying to impose some sort of kind of larger significance upon what he encountered. So Coleridge is like, that's not negative capability, right? That imposition of meaning upon experience. And then the other person here is actually the person with whom Keats is having his disquisition, and that's his friend Charles Dilke. In other letters, Keats and Dilke are very good friends, but he refers to Dilke as a Godwin perfectibility man, and that Dilke is the type of person who can't do anything without making up his mind about everything, right? So Dilke is the kind of person who has to have a system in order for him to kind of work within the world. He has to have his mind made up about everything. And Keats is struggling against this way of being in the world, of being, right, decisive, of knowing things, including knowing metaphysical truths. And he's saying that's not what's working for me in terms of what I see in great artistic genius. And then he's kind of saying that's not exactly what genius is for me either.
And we won't give any spoilers away in case you haven't seen the new Star Wars movie yet, but Mike and I saw it last night, and we were both struck by some of the ways in which how the Force is talked about sort of chimed with negative capability, right?
Very much so.
That being comfortable in not knowing, right?
Yeah.
That sense of feeling. And there's even a funny moment where one character says to another to reach out, and she literally reaches out with her hand.
Right. He's like, that's not what I'm talking about.
Stick, right?
That's right.
And he says, no, not that. So that's sort of irritable reaching,
That's
right?
right.
Like, oh, I have to be able to grasp this thing. Instead, right, it's a sort of figurative,
That's
emotional, passive way of knowing without striving after certainty.
That's right.
So in order to situate this letter in the context of early 19th century poetry a little bit more concretely, it's worth talking about what's happening in the world of poetry in and around 1817. So this is a very exciting time in the world of British poetry. There are a lot of people who are experimenting with poetry and trying to find new ways of writing and new purposes for writing. There's a lot of excitement in the world of poetry. There's a sense that something grand and new is happening. And Keats he's young, right? I mean, he's only just turned 22 at this point in 1817, and he's already finished his second book, which, awesome. Come on, I mean, Keats. So he's very accomplished, but his accomplishments are extremely rapid. I mean, in the course of 2 years, he goes from being a medical student who loves poetry to meeting some of the most prominent poets writing in English during that time period. So somewhere between December 22nd and 27th, Keats actually meets William Wordsworth for the first time. So Wordsworth was from a generation before Keats. He's 25 years older than Keats. And he's one of those writers who's really tried to reinvent what poetry can do. And so Keats, when he's growing up, he very much admires Wordsworth's poetry. It's a huge deal for him to actually meet the man, and he recites some of Endymion to Wordsworth, and Wordsworth has somewhat of a kind of dismissive comment, but it's a
very pretty piece of paganism.
Exactly, yeah. But you can sort of imagine Keats saying, yeah, that's right, I agree.
Yeah, sounds right.
In any case, part of what's going on with negative capability is about a split between a Wordsworthian model of poetry and what Keats is really developing with this idea of negative capability. And as Mike was talking about before, with Hazlitt's notion of genius versus Shakespeare as the exception to that rule, Wordsworth is very much in that former category. He stamps his identity on the poetry that he writes. I often joke with my students when I teach them Wordsworth that basically every Wordsworth poem is really just about what's going on in Wordsworth's mind. It might seem like it's about daffodils or something like that, but really it's about the poet's own processing of the world, what's happening around him. And so Keats, during this time period, at the end of 1817, as we've said, he's just finished a huge 4,000-line poetic project. It's his second book, and he's really thinking hard about what he values in poetry, what he's trying to aspire towards. And this thinking will continue in future letters. So in the spring of 1818, there are some other letters where he talks more specifically about a kind of anti-Wordsworthian stance that he's developing. And then towards the end of 1818, in October, he'll formulate another term. He talks about the chameleon poet, a poet who has no identity but takes on all these different identities, like a chameleon takes on its surroundings. And he contrasts that specifically with what he calls the Wordsworthian or egotistical sublime, right? So a sublimity that's rooted in an expression of an ego, a self. Where was I going?
Do we want to read the Keats quote on the Wordsworthian sublime?
Yeah, why don't we do that actually?
Shall I?
Go for it. Yeah,
So on the third page of your handout, this is clearly a later letter, comes up, about 10 months later. This is the letter to which Brian was referring, right? So he says to Richard Woodhouse, he writes, "As to the poetical character itself, I mean that sort of which, if I am anything, I am a member, that sort distinguished from the Wordsworthian or egotistical sublime," right? So Wordsworth is there equated with egotism, the ego, right? Which is the thing per se and stands alone, right? He's saying the poetical character that he says, it is not itself. It has no self. It is everything and nothing. It has no character. It enjoys light and shade. It lives in gusto, be it foul or fair, high or low, rich or poor, mean or elevated. It has as much delight in conceiving an Iago as in Imogen. What shocks the virtuous philosopher delights the chameleon poet. It does no harm from its relish of the dark side of things any more than from its taste for the bright one, because they both end in speculation. A poet is the most unpoetical of anything in existence because he has no identity. He is continually in, for, and filling some other body. The sun, the moon, the sea, and men and women who are creatures of impulse are poetical and have about them an unchangeable attribute. The poet has none, no identity. He is certainly the most unpoetical of all God's creatures.
So this is kind of this letter is often read as a distillation of or a further development of what Keats is articulating in the negative capability letter. And you can see Shakespeare is present here as well with a reference to Iago and Imogen, right? Those are two different Shakespearean characters, very different characters, right? Iago, the most villainous of villains. This notion of the chameleon poet is again tied to Shakespeare and to dramatic writing and the ability of the author to inhabit these very different personalities, but also to inhabit different things, right? Filling some other body, the sun, the moon, the sea, all these things that have an identity that the poet can enter into and try and take on. So what we thought we'd do next is look at two different poems, one which we would say is not very negatively capable, and one which is. And you can probably guess which one is which based on what we just said about Keats and Wordsworth. So
There's no surprise on this one at all. Nope.
So Mike will read the Wordsworth, and then I'll take on the Keats poem, and we'll have a little discussion.
Let's all of us discuss what we're detecting as some of the differences between these. So this is I wandered lonely as a cloud. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in a sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not be but gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft when on my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils.
Do we want to read this and then talk about both?
Yeah, let's talk about both. Yeah.
Okay, so this is To Autumn by Keats. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, to set budding more and still more later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer has o'erbrimmed their clammy cells. Who hath not seen thee oft amid thy store? Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, or on a half-reaped furrow sound asleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies, while thy hook spares the next swath and all its twined flowers. And sometimes like a gleaner, thou dost keep steady thy laden head across a brook, or by a cider press, with patient look, thou watchest the last oozings, hours by hours. Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them. Thou hast thy music too. While barred clouds bloom the soft dying day, and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue. Then, in a wailful choir, the small gnats mourn among the river sallows, borne aloft or sinking as the light wind lives or dies. In full-grown lands loud bleat from hilly bourne, hedge crickets sing, and now, with treble soft, the redbreast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies. Okay.
So let's just, as a group, let's make our way into these poems a little bit, right? So we've given up already, right, what we think of these two, right? Wordsworth is Wordsworthian, egotistical, sublime, where he has an experience and then stamps the meaning upon it. Do you see where that happens? Insights into that? What are you seeing in the poem there?
Well, I saw that he's firmly centered in this poem. He's always referring to his actions and his reactions.
Absolutely, yep. Wordsworth, right? The poem begins with I, right? I do this.
And at the very end, he's still there.
At the very end, he's still there, even more so. Yeah.
And also in the Wordsworth poem, it's not about more than it's about.
Right,
And every
yeah.
poem, you kind of sense that.
Yeah.
How in the Keats, in the first stanza, there's this sense of we are going somewhere, I gotta find out where we're going.
Yeah,
And then when you get
yeah.
to the second one, there's that thee.
Yeah.
Oh, a
Yeah.
thee.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Who's thee?
That's right. Perhaps a kind of a figure of autumn, right? This kind of even a kind of some sort of kind of sub-deity of autumn who he's kind of talking to at that point. But
Maybe a feminized one.
Very
More
feminized.
interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yep. The Wordsworth for me as well, right? It stamps itself upon the experience in that last stanza, right? It's been kind of about the I'm looking at the daffodils. I saw them. They did this, but now let me tell you what it meant to me, right? And he's like, right. So even leading into that final stanza, I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought, right? Oh, it gave me this treasure. It gave me these goods. Now let me tell you what that was. And then he says, what it means is it gave me this memory so that when I'm melancholic, right, when I'm kind of in the slough of despond, I can think back to this brilliant moment and then it lifts my spirits. And it's like, wah, wah. Right. I like this poem a good deal,
sure.
but it's not natively capable, right? So there's a lot of,
And I usually like to hate on Wordsworth a little bit, but then I feel bad and I feel like I have to defend him. So in his defense, I think what Wordsworth really does do well in his poetry is reveal his own mind's blind spots and his inability to understand in the moment. Right, so it's almost as if he has these experiences that are like negative capability, where he's uncertain and it's not. He knows that he's just hanging out with these daffodils and it's great, but it's only later that he figures it out. But then the poems are always about figuring it out later.
Right.
So the key for me,
that experience itself wasn't adequate in and of itself.
Right. And the key for me is the end of the third stanza. But little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. Right there, you realize that the real drama in this poem is that he didn't know how important this experience was. And so the poem is a way of saying, now I know. Now I'm certain why that was so good. It's because I can hang out on my couch and take a nap and the daffodils are back with me again. Which, it's not a bad formula.
That sounds great,
it's
right.
Good,
but it feels like a formula and it's not being content with half knowledge, right? It has to be, once I figured it out, now I have the poem. Yeah. Whereas Keats in To Autumn, I like what you said earlier when we were chatting about this. You said To Autumn almost feels like a kind of poem where like this kind of this avant-garde artist like takes a microphone out into a field and just kind of holds the microphone and kind of bends towards a brook and kind of listens to the breeze and that all of that kind of enters into this poem. And there might be a moment here where we have a little bit of this kind of thinking that feels like that kind of conceptualizing in the beginning of the third stanza, right? But other than that, it's right. First of all, there is no I in this, right? So the I is almost this kind of ghostly, strange presence that's kind of doing some of the perceiving and some of the feeling for the poem, but none of that kind of drive towards making a point.
If we wanted to turn To Autumn into a Wordsworth poem, we would just add a fourth stanza, and it would be, now that I've spent some time thinking about autumn, here's what it means to me. I mean, it would probably be a little bit more significant than that, but that would be the basic structure of it. That's often the Wordsworthian move, to reflect on what the process of writing this poem what sort of conclusions have been brought up. But as Mike points out, right, I mean, there's no I, there's no sense of, there's also really not much that happens in the poem connected with the speaker of the poem. All the action is external. It's, these sounds and images of plenitude in the first stanza where you just have, everything filled with fruit, with ripeness to the core, right? That like bursting, that sense of fullness identified in autumn here.
Except, with all of these details, which are wonderful, we wouldn't have them if it wasn't for the eye. If it wasn't
That's
for
of course,
the
absolutely.
I and
Yep.
EYE both.
That's
so
right.
Keats is there,
Indeed, absolutely.
but he doesn't
Yep.
have to tell us that he's there.
That's right.
That's
right.
the key, yeah.
Right, yeah, he's still making decisions about what goes where, and what gets included, and what gets excluded, you bet. But as a work of art, that is, it is much more subtle, yeah, yeah.
And Keats recognizes that art that moves through time has to up the ante. And every stanza does that. There's more of an investment, it's kind of mysterious, aesthetic, conceptual investment on the poet's part that brings the reader in even deeper.
I think that's right, yeah, there's a progression.
Yeah,
from
whereas
one
in the
stanza to the
Wordsworth
next,
poem,
but-
I kind of don't feel that.
Yeah, yeah.
Go ahead.
I like this poem too by Wordsworth.
Good, yeah.
I can't help, I thought of Van Gogh as soon as I finished.
Sunflowers or wheat fields?
Yeah, everything
Yeah.
with his sense
Okay.
of perception.
Sure, sure.
I saw his exhibit last summer.
Nice, yeah,
That's
Yeah.
what I thought of immediately, was maybe
yeah.
his perception through his art too.
Yeah.
I mean, you can see it in his poem.
Yeah, I hear that too. Although for me, I think I feel more Van Gogh even with To Autumn, where Keats actually talks about where that poem came from, where he was out and he kind of saw a kind of stubble field and the light was hitting it in just this right way, and he was like, it felt warm to me as if it were spring, right? So then he writes this poem from out of that experience, but the way in which he's kind of almost making this kind of, I mean, it feels right. We're on our way with this Keats poem. We're on our way towards expressionism.
Whether
Yeah.
it's words or painting, I think
Yeah.
it's all in both of these.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
If pressed with To Autumn, could anyone say sort of what the poem is like about in a fundamental way? And right with Wordsworth, it's sort of easy to say, well, it's about his recognition of how the beauty of the world can be a refuge later on, that he can be resting on his couch and then feel that happiness again. I think it's harder to make that kind of claim with the Keats poem.
The less you are able to paraphrase,
Yeah.
the better the art.
That's right. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like music.
Sure. Yeah. That's
I
right.
mean, it's there in it. I mean, you just experience it,
That's right.
and that's it. You can't, no matter what you say, they tell you like the waves, it sounds like this, like that. It will
Right.
sound as many things as there are people who listen.
That's right.
You
Yeah.
can't paraphrase it.
That's right.
And so, of course, I think this is Ode to Autumn, yes?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
And this, it's not easy to paraphrase it.
That's
And
right.
if you start paraphrasing it, you have to go back and look.
Right. Yeah. That's right. What was happening?
The
Yeah.
text itself, yeah.
Yeah.
However, of course, the Wordsworth poem is also beautiful because
Sure.
he
Yep.
manages to express something that is out of him,
Very much.
in
Sure.
front of
That's
him,
right.
in a much more
Yeah.
poetic and beautiful way
Yeah.
than anybody else could.
That's right.
That's what he was poet laureate, I think. Long time ago.
He was, yeah, for, I think, from like 1820 or so until his death in 1850, so for a long time.
Yeah. So Brian and I have, with doing some of this and even presenting negative capability in this way, we've kind of told you what is a kind of well-known story of negative capability. So this is a story that really got essentially formulated by a specific literary critic, a guy named Walter Jackson Bate, who was one of Keats's great biographers in the mid-20th century. Bate, while an undergraduate, wrote a book, his senior thesis, essentially for Harvard, was on negative capability. Bates' biography of Keats, one of its middle chapters called Negative Capability. And Bate actually talks about how when he was a high school student, his father brought home a book from the library, and it was John Dewey's Art as Experience. And while reading that, Walter Jackson Bate encountered the term negative capability, which Dewey actually quotes there. And from that point on, a kind of love affair with the term negative capability started for Walter Jackson Bate. The story we've been telling you is largely Walter Jackson Bate's version of that. I like to say if negative capability is Jesus, then Walter Jackson Bate is Paul. Right? He's the disciple who will create the theology that tells you the meaning of the mystery, right? But what Brian and I want to do with a few of the minutes that we have remaining here before we move into cake and pure celebration, we want to kind of complicate the story a little bit. And so it's important to, and so this is one of the things, Brian and I have been working on this. We're editing a book that's going to be coming out next year from Liverpool University Press. It's a collection of essays. It's called Keats's Negative Capability, New Origins and Afterlives. So we've got a number of contributors who are telling some different stories about negative capability. And one of the most, for me, there are a couple fascinating aspects of negative capability. One of the things you'll note is that it feels as though we're taking negative capability very seriously, right? It's like, here's this magical concept, right? And it's powerful. But one of the most important kind of context for negative capability is the fact that Keats is walking home from these absurdist, beautiful, silly pantomimes, right? And that has been a part of the negative capability story that has been essentially written out of how we think about negative capability. I literally think, because of the word negative, right, we tend to think of it as kind of often too tragic, dark, serious. But one of the, I'm so happy that I think it's the first essay in our collection of essays. There's a young scholar named Brian Bates who's putting negative capabilities back squarely into the context of the Christmas pantomime and really trying to read it in light of the pantomimes and looking at how the pantomimes used humor to really kind of overturn and challenge social relations. So people in high classes would be struck low, and those in the lower classes would be raised up. And that Keats was interested in how humor could create these transformations, and it's a vital story. But we have some, right, indeed, right, so the chameleon poet, right, switching high and low, foul and fair, right, all of those are kind of fair game. It's some vital new ways, I think, to think about negative capability. I do have to say that we've got terrific essays in the book, I think. One of them is by this guy here. It turns out, why don't you say a few words, Brian, about what you're working on?
So if you look at this image that we have on the back of the first page in your handout, you can see this is handwriting. This, however, is not Keats's handwriting. We don't actually have a manuscript of this letter. We only know this letter through a transcript. So this transcript was made by a guy named John Jeffrey in 1845. He was the second husband of Georgiana Wiley Keats, who married John's brother, George, and George and Georgiana moved to Louisville, Kentucky in 1818. George lived until 1841, and then after he died, Georgiana remarried this guy named John Jeffrey, who was a Scottish engineer. A gas man, so he built gas works across the Midwest and the Southeast, so cities that were lit in the middle of the 19th century with natural gas. John Jeffrey was a part of at least some of those towns. Louisville, Cincinnati, Havana, Cuba, so I think New Orleans. So he's not a poetry guy, right? He's a gas man, not a poetry man. But he had a bunch of letters by John Keats, and in 1845 he just happened to see a notice in the newspaper saying that a guy back in England was preparing a biography of John Keats, and that he had gathered all the necessary papers to do this biography. And John Jeffrey thought, hey, you don't have my papers.
There's a stack right here.
And probably he wanted to make a little money. right? So he sends a letter to, nothing wrong with that.
That's all
okay.
fine, all good.
Sends a letter to this biographer, Richard Monckton Milnes, and says, I've got a bunch of letters by John Keats. Do you want me to copy them and send them your way for your biography? So he does. Here's the problem. Geoffrey was horrible at that task of transcribing.
Terrible transcriber.
Terrible. And we know this because of the 15 letters he transcribed, the manuscripts of 9 of those still exist. So you can look at his transcripts and look at the originals and see just what a horrible job he did.
How bad was it, Brian?
Okay,
Like, yeah,
so
give me.
here's the most egregious example. There's one letter that in the standard edition, 20th century edition of Keats's letters, this letter runs to 34 pages in that book. The editor of that prints Geoffrey's transcript as well to show how much he cut. That runs to 3 pages. So that's cutting a fair amount from the letter.
And without comment, without indication by John Geoffrey that, hey, I'm cutting some stuff here. Just lets it go by.
Yeah. So that's one. I mean, he just cuts out. Sometimes it's smaller things, a couple sentences here and there. But there are instances where he's cutting pages and pages out of these letters.
It is so bad that, in fact, a very estimable critic of John Keats and an editor, a guy named Robert Giddings, actually says that very often John Geoffrey's transcriptions are a travesty of what Keats wrote. And Giddings goes so far as to speculate that negative capability might not actually even be Keats's term.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Has anyone attempted to do what should have been done?
Which is?
Go through Keats's letters and transcribe them properly?
Well, the ones that still exist, we've now had a number of good editors who've done it over the last 150 years or so.
Of course, you've lost so much.
That's right.
The problem is some are lost. So the negative capability letter, that manuscript has been lost since sometime between 1845 and 1833, just 1883, sorry. And we know that for a couple reasons. One is that Emma Keats, who's the niece of John Keats, became the sort of guardian of all the Keats materials, and she gave away some letters. And so she probably gave the negative capability letter to someone. But you can see some inaccuracies just on the page here. It's maybe a little hard to read, but on the right side of the third line, this is where it's saying, several things dovetailed in my mind, comma, and at once it struck me. And then that crossed out thing after that is at once again. So Geoffrey wrote, and at once it struck me at once. And then realized, oh wait, I already wrote at once, and crossed it out. And there are all sorts of examples of this sort of thing when you go and look carefully at his transcripts, which I've done in a painstaking process.
We joke that Brian has begun a whole new field, and it's called John Geoffrey Studies.
Yeah.
There's Keats Studies, but now there's John Geoffrey Studies.
And I'm the only expert. But one other thing to point out about this, you'll notice that negative capability, both of the words are capitalized and they're both underlined. The capitalization wouldn't be unusual for Keats he capitalizes in a haphazard way all the time. The underlining is very uncharacteristic for Keats. He almost never underlines, and when he does, it's usually not to indicate this is an important word everyone should remember, which I think is how people typically read that, right? It's like, negative capability, pay attention.
We italicize it and capitalize it as if it's the title for something, as if it has this massive significance.
But the few times when Keats does underline in his letters, it's usually because he's indicating some bit of wordplay. So it's very possible that Geoffrey got this wrong, and Keats was making some sort of pun that we don't recognize because Geoffrey got it wrong. It's also possible that Geoffrey knew that he couldn't read this phrase and underlined it to indicate uncertainty, because at other points he does that in his transcriptions. When he gets something wrong and he clearly doesn't know, he underlines it to say, So, right, this could be another one of those moments. So this is the way that my essay tries to challenge some of the certainty around negative capability. We really don't know much about the letter itself, so it's hard to base a whole 200th anniversary celebration
something might not have a concept that might, well, it's there. The concept's definitely there, but a lot of the details about it. And I tend to think that it's, for me, what's fascinating. I actually do think that a huge part of the substance of negative capability is actually, though, in not even in the definition of negative capability, but it's in the term negative capability itself. It's so awesome. Right? Can we just take a minute to say how cool it is that Keats, maybe, or that somebody, John Jeffrey, right, put the words negative and capable together, right? Like, it's real. It's one of the reasons why I think we're drawn to this is just the pure, like, kind of sexy, paradox, seductive nature of that, right? That's what draws us to it. I mean, we would not be having this event if what Keats wrote was Shakespearean capability, right? It would not have attracted this kind of attention. We would not be seeing it on Woody Allen movies or on True Detective, or Philip Pullman would not be having Subtle Knives powered by Shakespearean capability. But negative capability, that is one, I think it's sexy and dark, but it also can travel very easily, right? It can be applied beautifully easily, and so it can be used in all of these very different contexts. So, which is not then, that's no sort of critique. It's I mean that to praise. I think it's such a delicious, luscious kind of term. But whether or not it was actually Keats, we're not completely certain. Let's chat a bit. Kathleen had a question, and Paul, and up here, yeah, let's talk.
Well, I was listening to when you bring that up. I've always heard it in my mind. We've been saying the term as if it's a term.
That's right.
Where the emphasis is equal, negative capability.
That's right.
But I've often heard it in the context of the letter as if it's something different from capability. We think of being able to do this.
That's right.
Capable of this. Sort of, so that the inflection would be a sort of negative capability, an ability to hold oneself back.
That's right.
From defining or doing.
That's
so
right.
The inflection on negative.
That's right.
Would be a little lighter. And
right.
What we were saying about leaving the panic.
That's right. Good.
The humor and the lightness.
Yeah.
Sort of ability not to jump on what it means. Kind of negative.
That's exactly right. Yeah. That's absolutely.
Yeah, almost just like a non-capability.
Right.
Right.
Like a non-capability that's really cool to have.
That's right. That's right.
It puts you in a place you might not otherwise let yourself go to.
You bet. Yeah. Paul had your hand up in here.
Okay. So, I've been part of this project for a long time.
You have that. Yes.
Yeah.
Our apologies, Paul.
I'm really sad that somehow I didn't pay attention. Because I should have contributed something to this collection.
We might have been a few pints in.
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
But I was struck by the fact that the real inspiration for this concept is Shakespeare.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as a post-colonial, I'm highly suspicious of anything. Highly suspicious of Shakespeare. And the reason is because Shakespeare was presented to me as a symbol of creative or aesthetic sophistication, right? Which is also a code for what you might call the quintessence of Englishness, right?
Yep.
The problem I have with this concept is that not only the paradox in the concept itself, negative capability, but also this feeling that there's something prescriptive about what Keats was suggesting, right? Shakespeare is the model for this thing that I'm talking about, right? And what's what, or courage is not.
Sure.
But if you look at, if I just go back to the poems here, I just want to give you a quick example. You go to the third stanza.
Right.
Of Wordsworth, saying, the waves beside them dance, but they are deep the sparkling waves and bleed. a poet could not but be gay. In such a jocund company, I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the shooting would have brought.
Right.
A certain lack of clarity, a lack of prescription, a lack of final meaning, a certain, which is what he calls negative capability.
Yes.
We see it in Wordsworth,
Right, sure.
but we're suggesting that it's not there. This becomes problematic for me. So was
Sure.
this a coded way for Keats prescribing how all writers all over the world should use this English model for how to be good creative writers? So I wonder whether you guys have problematized this.
Well, I would say a couple things. One is that, I was going to say this earlier, if the Wordsworth poem didn't have the last stanza, it would actually be negatively capable, or at least more so, right? Also, we didn't get to mention this, but Wordsworth has plenty of poems that we would describe as negatively capable. I mean, we've...
A slumber did my spirit seal.
Yeah, you want to read
Right,
this?
this very
It's
short
8
word,
lines.
right? A slumber did my spirit seal. I had no human fears. She seemed a thing that could not feel the touch of earthly years. No motion has she now, no force. She neither hears nor sees. Rolled around in earth's diurnal course with rocks and stones and trees. Right? What are we to make of that? Don't know. It's powerful and terrifying and magical, and I couldn't paraphrase it very easily. I mean, so, yeah. So,
and Keats has poems that have a kind of palpable design in the way that he identifies with Wordsworth. So I would say, yeah, it's really not prescriptive. I think it's, and Keats is not systematic in any of his thinking along these lines. I mean, he writes these things in letters. He never publishes like a manifesto about poetry in the way that Wordsworth writes several essays of that sort, where he kind of lays out how he understands poetry.
Absolutely, but you have to say, like, let's be clear though, like the Hazlitt is clear, Hazlitt, right, whom I'm certain that Keats is getting a huge amount of this from. He loves Hazlitt. And Hazlitt is definitely using Shakespeare to do this kind of British thing where it's certainly raising British literature over, say, French literature. So even this discussion Keats talks about earlier in the negative capability letter, this moment where he's talking about this dinner he had and these men who had these kind of mannerisms with pouring a decanter, and Keats said, I learned at that dinner, right, why it is that humor is superior to wit, right? And so these guys are mannered and witty, but he prefers humor. Well, in Hazlitt, right, humor is also better than wit, and humor is a British virtue, and wit is kind of, that's what the French do, right? I mean, so even though, so I do think it's deeply embedded in kind of some of these uses. I would say that for me, Keith, what's fascinating about negative capability is that it's clearly a critical concept. The first thing that Keats does with it is go bash Coleridge, right? Once I have negative capability, it's not just it might be a kind of beautiful right, just kind of dispossession and let things happen. But the first thing Keats himself does with it is critique this other poet, right? So no, I have a feeling that it's probably deeply intertwined with some of these kind of narrative, using Shakespeare to differentiate British literature and kind of strands of it, major strands of it from other literatures. And then I know that that's still something that's happening in, say, contemporary American poetry, where people they use negative capability to try to argue why their variety of contemporary poetry is superior to other people's. But of course, what's fascinating is that almost anybody can argue that their poetry is negatively capable, right? So it's fascinating how it gets used in those different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you should have been in this. Yeah.
The next one. We'll get you in the next one.
Was that close enough, Paul? A few ideas there? Yeah, okay, thanks.
We'll talk about it.
Yeah, good, exactly. Thanks. Yeah.
I lost my first thought, but
Yeah.
I thought of something else in this very last stanza of To Autumn.
Yeah.
He even hints at the French. Where are the
Speak
songs
louder,
of spring?
Hints at what?
He hints at the French, did you say?
Yes.
Right.
With Where are the snows of yesterday?
Right, sure. That's right. Yep. Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, he's.
Thank you. Good. You had a question.
I was just going to add something to what Kathleen was saying about negative capability. Isn't this why we love literature, and especially poetry? Because I remember from teaching, when you have students who are not English majors
That's right.
in a class, and they say, but what does it mean?
That's right.
It could mean this, it could mean that, within a certain realm.
That's
You
right.
can't just pull anything into it. You kind of peel away the layers of a poem to find truth, capital T.
Yeah.
You may not find it.
Yeah.
And your truth might be different than my truth.
That's right.
But that's okay.
Yep.
We can walk out of the room and be happy with it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a lot of what Keats is saying right there. I can be happy not really knowing.
Negative capability has become an important term in some of the teaching of poetry. So there's a book out now called Why Poetry by Matthew Zapruder, and I was like, I kind of have a negative capability radar. I have a pretty good sense of when it's going to appear. So I was actually a little shocked it didn't show up in the Star Wars movie. But I was like, okay, there's going to be a bit on negative capability, and certainly, right there it is. There's a chapter on negative capability. It's precisely become the term. It's kind of become the go-to term where you're trying to talk to young readers about this other way of engaging the world, and then therefore engaging texts and engaging poems. So again, it has that kind of transportability and can move into different contexts. And so it's become a go-to phrase for that, which also isn't to mean like that's a really important trait to have when you're engaging especially certain kinds of poetry. So no, it's great. Don't mean to critique that way of being in the world at all. It's just that with this particular instance in Keats, there are all these fascinating questions to explore. Here, and then we'll go back.
I think negative capability is, I don't know why as the lady said, there are many truths, and negative has negative connotations.
Right, that's right.
Capability has positive.
That's right.
And anything in the world is a product of the thesis and its antithesis.
Sure.
Life is ambiguous.
Sure, that's right.
Existence is ambiguous.
Yep.
That's right. We keep talking on Mother Nature and abundance and this and that, but Mother Nature brings hurricanes, the same.
Of course,
So
Keats is so alive to that dialectical nature of nature. If you think about those great odes, if you think about the Grecian urn, literally turns, right? We're looking at the lovers, and then he turns this imaginary urn, and then you see the cattle being led to sacrifice. So you get love, and you get death, and then you get the meditation, or Ode on a Nightingale, right? Where it's like, here I am, this earthbound sod, and here is this kind of ethereal, otherworldly thing, and then it's the negotiations between those. So Keats was alive to that, and so in negative capability, it's so beautifully Keatsian because we feel that dialectic happening in just the two words themselves. Yeah.
And it's there in To Autumn as well, and that you start off with this first stanza, images of ripeness and fullness, but then by the last stanza, it's very subtle, but the soft dying day, the light wind that lives or dies, the full-grown lamb, loud bleating from hill. It's all these sort of the mourning of the. So you start to get towards all these images associated with death, and that
this is way too easy a reading of this poem. But the beauty of To Autumn for me has always been the way that it is a synthesis. It has gotten rid of the dialectic of life and death, and it's now trying to just as closely weave them together as possible. So it's not thesis and antithesis. It's let's just make an object out of the two brought together, which is why it's so powerful.
It's the thesis and antithesis happen somewhere
that
else,
happened
and then
before
the poem
now.
is.
That's right. And this is last of his kind of great odes. So it came at the end where he's working out the dialectics in other ones. This one feels like pure synthesis to me.
Yeah.
Back there, please.
First of all, I was just observing that the Wordsworth poem totally fits his own definition of poetry, being a spontaneous.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. That's right.
Recollected in tranquility.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. That's right.
Thinking about it later,
yeah,
and key to his writing. And then as far as the quote goes that you have on the first page, you haven't really talked about the importance of beauty.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
That it isn't just holding multiple perspectives
That's right.
simultaneously, but it's this pursuit of beauty.
That's right.
And then I had a question about, you were talking about Shakespeare and his ability to imaginatively enter each of his characters' lives.
Yeah.
And you called it sympathetic something.
Sympathetic imagination.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Beauty?
Well, yeah, you want to? I want to quickly, sympathetic imagination, again, Keats gets a lot of his thinking from that on Hazlitt. One of the things, Hazlitt takes on Thomas Hobbes, and so he takes on Hobbes's ideas of mind as tabula rasa, and that our main motivations are always self-interested, and Hazlitt, from his first publication, is constantly arguing against those views. So he's like, the mind is not just a blank slate, it is projective and adhesive, and our motives aren't purely self-interested because, and then he makes the argument, he says, for me to even be self-interested, I have to be thinking and imagining my way into the life of my future self. And he said the same sort of action for me to be able to imagine that allows me to imagine what it's like to feel and think like other beings, right? And so Hazlitt's already, so sympathetic imagination is kind of it's again tied into these kind of conversations that are happening around him and happening in Hazlitt. And beauty, for me, the big thing, the beauty for Keats means essentially kind of concreteness and intensity. And that, right, you shouldn't be going for truth, which is going to probably short circuit, right, larger, more important processes, and instead you should be kind of in this kind of weird, magical, negatively capable way, trying to kind of track and follow out where the poetic process is taking you. That's all I got.
Yeah, I can add. So I think we maybe briefly mentioned an earlier letter at the end of November 1817. Keats sends a letter to his friend Benjamin Bailey. And in that letter, it has several other famous phrases from Keats's letters, and specifically about beauty and truth. And of course, the line from Ode on a Grecian Urn, truth is beauty, beauty truth. Keats is thinking about that at this point as well. So in this earlier letter, just a month before this one, he says, what the imagination seizes as beauty must be truth. So beauty takes that kind of precedence, right? And it's this idea of concreteness and intensity. Earlier in the negative capability letter, he talks about intensity as well. And for him, the intensity is rooted in this fully realized sensory detail, right? And I think that's one of the things you see into Autumn as well, is how it captures that concreteness throughout. So yeah, truth is sort of the thing that emerges from that pursuit of beauty, right? And that's why it says here that it obliterates all consideration, right? As long as you pursue that one thing, then the rest will follow.
Beauty is truth. You do that, and you get the truth. You don't have to add truth to it. Like,
yeah, I got the order wrong. No, I said truth is beauty, beauty, truth.
Beauty is truth, truth, beauty.
Steve, what's the order? You know. Yeah. Okay. Truth, beauty. Yeah.
Beauty is truth, truth, beauty.
You're right.
Yeah.
The Simpsons, I get confused because there's a Simpsons episode where they're at like a military school and the kid says the line, but he gets the order wrong. And then the instructor says, but sometimes the truth can be horrible. How can that be beautiful?
Right.
Anyway, yeah.
Military
school.
Capability, yeah.
Exactly.
Steve?
I have a question. I'm not sure how to quite phrase it, but I'm going to try my best. So it seems like a lot of the describing of, sort of this like Wordsworth versus Keats as two different types of poetry. They both are still rooted in, maybe, the egotistical sublime and negative capability being two sides of the same coin of genius.
Yeah.
Working as a lineage through poetry.
Yeah.
Or maybe two sides of a many-sided die.
Right. Right, exactly.
Is there a work in, Keats studies or negative capability studies where negative capability is seen as inherent in language itself, when someone is trying to describe, the ineffable, the transcendent, or the mysterious.
Yeah. One of the things that happens because of the particular use of the word negative is that there have been some conversations about negative capability and the idea of negative theology, right? So that the only way to I'm thinking of like St. John the Divine kind of has this, I forget the piece, I'm not thinking of it right now, piece of writing where he kind of says, you can't say what God is, all you can do is say what God is not. So that's negative theology, right? And so somehow those do get linked up.
The other thing that comes to mind is Mike mentioned John Dewey and the book Art as Experience. And it's less with, I don't know if it's with language in Dewey, but he talks about the category of the aesthetic as inherently uncertain and mysterious. And so he's talking about negative capability as kind of an inherent aspect of any sort of aesthetic experience, whether you're reading a Wordsworth poem or a Keats poem. So that would be another way to come at it. But specifically with respect to language, I don't know, nothing comes to mind. But it's a really interesting question. Yeah. And it'd be interesting to look as well at what kinds of theories of language are operative in the early 19th century and that people like Keats and Wordsworth might be responding to.
We've already gone a bit over our time, so let me say this: I hope you can tell, no matter what, you can't be certain of much if you want to be a good Keatsian, but you can be certain that Brian and I actually do like to talk about this stuff. So if you'd like to talk more about this, please hang out, and we're happy to chat more. While we do that, we actually do have cake. Brian and I did not make the cake, so you can trust the cake. It's made by the good people at Schnucks. We have negative cake ability. But actual people who have cake ability made that. So I'll cut that cake, and we've got it. So if you want, please do join us to celebrate John Keats and his beautiful inventions. And thank you all for spending some time with us this afternoon.
Thank you.